Hey everybody, it's Ed. Two quick announcements before we start. I want to thank two brand new podcast supporters, Ken Jacobson and Avery, both who signed up to support the podcast on a monthly basis through Patreon. And if you want to learn more about that or other options, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support. Second thing is at the end of this month, so February 22nd and 23rd of 2023, I'll be in Houston at the Texas chapter of the Wildlife Society's annual meeting. I'll be hosting two different panel discussions with some of Texas' most accomplished conservation folks. One will be on landscape scale conservation in a mostly private land state, and the other will be on equitable access to the outdoors. Because Texas has so much private land and so little public land, these topics present very unique challenges and opportunities that are not found elsewhere in the West. So if you want to learn more about that event, there's a link in the episode notes or on the events page of mountainandprairie.com, but I'll be recording both of those conversations and releasing them as podcast episodes. So I hope you enjoy them when they come out. Hope to see some of you in Houston. Thanks so much. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Cole Mannix. Cole was the president and founder of the Old Salt Co-op, a new purpose-driven company that, quote, provides meat raised with integrity from Montana landscapes its customers know and care about. Cole and his team partner with a growing number of Montana ranches, butchers, chefs, and businesses to connect customers and producers, while simultaneously encouraging and promoting a deeper understanding of land stewardship, community, and the interconnectedness of the Montana landscape. Cole was born and raised in Montana, and he's a member of the fifth generation of the Mannix family, who's been stewarding their family ranch in Montana's Blackfoot Valley since the late 1800s. Cole has followed a fascinating educational and career path, mixing his degrees in biology, philosophy, and theology, with wide-ranging work in both entrepreneurial ventures and non-profit conservation work. And as you'll hear in this conversation, the common thread that connects all of Cole's experiences is a deep love and respect for the land and all that it can provide. And one of the most exciting projects that Cole's currently working on is the Old Salt Festival, a 3-day festival taking place this June on the Mannix Ranch, located just outside Helmville, Montana. And it's much more than a music festival. It's a celebration of land and land stewardship, and it'll feature an eclectic mix of artists, authors, poets, storytellers, chefs, and more. I'll be at the event hosting some live podcast conversations, and there will be appearances by a number of past Mountain and Prairie guests, including singer-songwriter Riddy Arman, author-poet Chris Dombrowski, author-rancher Bryce Andrews, and more. Novelist David James Duncan will be reading, and Chef Eduardo Garcia will be cooking. So Cole and I spent a lot of time discussing this event, its purpose, and how the whole idea came together. This is a wonderful conversation about following your interest, working hard, and doing purpose-driven work that's connected to land and community. Check out the episode notes for a full list of all the topics we discussed, as well as links to the co-op and this summer's festival. Thanks so much to Cole for joining me, and thank you for listening. Cole Mannix, I knew you had a lot of stuff going on. I knew you were busy, but as I was doing my internet research for this conversation, it became very clear that I think you're operating with about 36 hours per day because I don't understand how you get it all done. And the reason I'm saying all that is because I just appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me because I'm super interested in everything you're doing. I was thinking the first thing we could talk about just to clear up some possible confusion is I've had Kate Mannix on this podcast, and it was an awesome conversation. And with all my internet research, the one thing I cannot figure out is the Mannix family tree. So how is Kate Mannix related to you?
Yeah, so Kate married my cousin Brian.
Okay.
And the Mannix Ranch is my mom and dad and my dad's two brothers. And then I'm one of four siblings. Brian, who Kate married, is one of two siblings. And then the third pair has three kids. And so I live in town in Helena, but a lot of the rest of my family lives back on the ranch. All three of my sets of aunts and uncles do. And then I have three siblings that are on the ranch, and I have now three first cousins and their spouses that are on the ranch. And so it's always been a big goal of the family to figure out how to have more livelihoods in little tiny Helmville, Montana. And they've managed this ranch together throughout my, life. So, they're in business together, and we're also family. So it's a unique set of challenges, but we clearly love it. I mean, everybody has an ongoing interest in the ranch and has loved the experience of growing up there. So.
Yeah, it seems like such a special place, and I'm so excited to get the opportunity to come up there this summer for the festival, which we'll talk about a lot here in a little while. But can you just give a quick overview of the history of the ranch? Because you're the fifth generation, if I am doing my math right. When did your family? Where did they come from when they came to Montana?
Well, my grandma's side came in the late 1860s, and that part of the family was coming from West Virginia, and it was right after the Civil War. And so we actually have an early set of letters of the one brother who had fought on the North writing back to his brother that had fought on the South. And basically it was their ongoing dialogue. We only have, the letters going one way. We don't know what the brother said back or if the brother even responded, but those letters just randomly showed up in the 1990s. A family from Plant City, Florida called us and said, we have all these letters from your family and we want to figure out how to get them to you. So that was an amazing window into kind of one part of our history. And then the Mannix side actually got there in the 1880s, had come from Ireland by way of New York. So ever since then, it's been a family, it's been the same family ranch, and, pieces of land have changed in terms of what's part of the ranch today. But essentially it began as a sheep and later cattle operation. Today it's mostly a cattle operation. But we've ranched since the 1880s.
That's really cool. I mean, that's so impressive on many levels. When I was in grad school, I remember I took a class about family businesses, and there was some stat. It was something like 98% of family businesses don't make it past the third generation. And so here you are in the fifth, and I mean, I guess sixth when you think about your boys, and you're in the agricultural business, which is not the easiest business to be in. So I think we could spend 3 hours just talking about your family's history. But I was thinking one thing I want to make sure we hit on early on is your newest venture, the Old Salt Co-op, because I came across it before you and I were actually introduced, and it really intrigued me. And so I was wondering if you just kind of give an overview of what the Old Salt Co-op is.
Yeah, well, essentially it's a meat company. We're doing a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, our big, hairy, audacious goal is to sell everything that the founding ranches can produce locally. And, that mostly means Montana urban areas. What we really would like to do is to be able to sell to 5,000 Montana families beef and lamb and pork regularly. Exactly how that distribution model ultimately will shake out, there's a lot to be discovered, but the idea has been that we would deliver door to door. We're going to begin by shipping. We launched the meat program just literally a month ago. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot to learn about how we're actually going to get it in people's hands. But if you look at the meat industry, getting into the high scale ways of distributing meat, go through a Cisco or an FSA, and then try to get in wholesale accounts that move a big volume. That is a very tightly controlled world. And so, the big challenge of Old Salt is that these kind of individual ranches that are part of the founding group, they each have their own kind of small direct group of customers that they sell beef or lamb or pork to. And we're basically asking ourselves a question, okay, instead of, 400 or 500 individuals, can we do 4,000 or 5,000? If we can, I think we have a real shot, not to, change the whole world, but to make a real big difference for the founding ranches and potentially to add more as we go that can participate in that market that we work to build. And so at the core, we're a meat company. But when we asked ourselves the question, well, how do we get to know all those people? How do they know us? We thought, microbreweries have been so successful as this renaissance in the beer world. And a big part of it is most of those are not marketing, the sustainability of the farms that are raising grain that are going to a brewery. They're really just a fun community place where people hang out all the time.
Yep.
And so we told ourselves that we're trying to do for meat kind of what breweries have done for beer. Local food is more about local personal connections. And so we decided that we wanted to start a restaurant. We did that about 14 months ago and have been operating that one. It's been a ton of fun. It's called the Old Salt Outpost right here in Helena. We have another restaurant coming that is sort of a different concept, butcher shop and a wood-fired grill here also in Helena, which is kind of the next step in being able to feature our meats, but also just have a community establishment that would be an exciting new addition to Helena. And we, this Old Salt Festival was a big project that we've been working on for some time. And it's a big on-ranch event at my family's ranch in Helmville, where we're trying to invite a couple thousand people out for 3 days to experience wood-fired cooking, three big grand meals and kind of regional Americana music, and then a whole bunch of content surrounding what we care the most about and what we think a lot of Montanans care about, which is the outdoors, wild conservation, maintaining big, wide open spaces, and general ecological integrity. And so there's going to be a whole range of content at this festival, which I think there's a lot of good things in itself, but it'll also be a powerful marketing tool to get that many people out and experience what these little rural working lands, valleys, what they mean for the state.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. I mean, I think for people to become really conservation minded, they have to get out and experience it and kind of fall in love with it. And a lot of people can, it's relatively easy if you live in the West where there's a lot of public land to go out and fall in love with hiking or with hunting on public land or with, anything that involves spending time out in these wide open public places. But I think it's hard for a lot of people to really understand and fall in love with private land conservation and land stewardship and everything that your family's been doing for 5 generations, just because they don't have access. And so the fact that y'all are opening up your family ranch to the public for this event I really do think it's going to create one of these ripple effects where people are able to kind of get it. Cause I mean, that's how I came around to it. I'm from North Carolina, but luckily I was able to get access to ranches in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, Colorado, and understand what people like your family have been doing for generations. And it made me understand private land conservation and private land stewardship and how important that is for everything. So,
right.
Food production, ecosystems, wildlife, all of it. So one question about Old Salt. I mean, you've had this really cool career that I want to talk about and cool education. It's very winding path in the best term. I mean, I feel like you've hit kind of every side of education and work. And so before this, you were at Western Landowners Alliance, which is an awesome organization. Was there a specific moment or something that happened, maybe the pandemic, I don't know, something that made you decide, all right, now we need to start Old Salt? Was there a kind of a turning point?
Yeah, I think there was many things coming together. I mean, my interest in working at Western Landowners Alliance, where we focused on agricultural policy and wildlife policy and peer-to-peer learning between landowners. I had, become interested in that because it had so much to do with my growing up, with my own family's operation and what our hopes for the future. But it also was a experience in how challenging the policy landscape really is when you look at all of the big changes, that need to happen. And at the same time, COVID was really just taken off in March of 2020, and we were all virtual. And it felt for me like the right time where if we, once we get on the other end of the pandemic, there will likely be federal monies out there to support business. And I just needed something really tangible to pour my time into. And so it just felt like, prior to Western Landowners Alliance, I had been part of a 5-year effort by other ranches in the West to create a beef company that had failed, but I'd learned a lot. And as long as I was at Western Landowners, I think I was always trying to figure out how to do it a little bit differently the next time. And so you only have so many opportunities to step out and take a big risk. And, I'm 38 and it felt like these things take so much time to build. It felt like the right time. So I sat down and started writing the business plan. And I had quite a few people in my network, other ranches, people in the meat industry, people in the food industry who, I trusted, and I felt like there was a lot to build on. I also just think, Montana is ripe for what we're trying to do. And I think Helena, where I live, is also ripe for it. So all those things together, and it just started happening. It just started kind of pouring out.
What was that, if you don't mind me asking, because I just kind of made a similar move, leaving nonprofit conservation and going all in on this podcast stuff, mm-hmm. which seems a lot less consequential than the work you're doing. But, that we got kids that are about the same age. I'm older than you. I'm an old man compared to you. But what was that conversation like with your wife or your family about when you're leaving a place that has health insurance and you're getting the check just showing up in your bank account every month? I mean, what was that conversation like as you like had to, burn the boats and go for it?
Well, I didn't marry an entrepreneur. My wife, Eileen, is just amazing, but she's definitely, we're polar opposites.
That's good. That's how I am with my wife. That's what you need, that, or else it'd be really lopsided in a bad way.
It's true. And she is a physical therapist, and she had a stable job here in town. And we were fortunate to have a ton of family support here in town. Her folks are just amazing. And they're in their 70s, but they have more energy than anybody else I know. And they do a lot of childcare for us. And when we got married in 2012, there was a discussion about, could she see herself living in Helmville, where the family ranch is, because that's so close to my heart. And she thought, well, maybe Helmville, just to give a little context, it's about 70 miles upriver from Missoula on the Blackfoot River. And it's small enough where, growing up K through 8, that was the only kid in my class. And it's not very far from Helena either, about 60 miles to the west, but it's a very different thing to raise kids in Helmville than it is Helena.
Yeah.
And I think she's so close with her family here that it was, she knew that I needed to find a way in my own professional life to feel that I could do something that was of some use in the things that I cared about, ranching and food and meat. And so I think she realized, I am who I am in terms of how I'm wired. And this was a way that we could make a life in Helena, and despite not being on the ranch, be a part of it.
That's cool. Maybe we could connect our wives and they could commiserate about their wacko husbands.
I'm sure they'd have a lot of legitimate complaints.
So back to Old Salt and the meat. If I go on the Old Salt website, which anybody can, and order meat, what am I getting? Like what's so unique about your meat? What's the value proposition there, to use my old MBA terminology?
We currently sell beef and lamb and pork. And we have tried to stay away from all of the different label claims and certifications that are out there in the world, because in a lot of ways we think that what ultimately shows up on a label just doesn't communicate all that much of what matters. And so the folks, the ranches that are part of Old Salt and that own Old Salt, on the beef side, they raise grass-finished animals. Many of them sell into other third-party programs that require no hormones and no antibiotics and that kind of thing. And so those things are also true about our meats, but we've decided to basically leave those things to the FAQs. And what we're really trying to do is to sell our values about soil health, wide open spaces, wildlife habitat, and better relationships between Montanans and between all the people who moved to Montana or already live in Montana and care about the outdoors, better understanding between them and the rural folks who are in production agriculture. And so when somebody buys our meat, they're going to get, we sell boxes of lamb bundles and beef bundles, and we sell, we do sausages and cooking oil and cured meats. They're going to get a really high quality product. But at the end of the day, it's more about what they're connected to. I think we talk a lot in regenerative agriculture about, it's a little bit back to what we were discussing earlier, where if you look at what Meat Eater or some of these hunting organizations have done, they've given a way to people to participate in the landscape.
Yep.
You can go just become utterly absorbed in how to explore Montana's public lands and hone your hunting skills and get interested in what makes the landscape tick. It's really hard, I think, to figure out how do people participate in agriculture at some scale, in some meaningful way, rather than having a passive relationship with it. And regenerative agriculture requires regenerative customers as much as it requires different practices and, kind of rethinking our systems at the ranch level. It really just requires people who are deciding to be more connected with the whole system of production.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think, we still are going to struggle with this question of how do we allow people to really participate. And so for us, that goes back to the festival and the events that we're trying to put on.
So when you think about the business, when you were writing up this business plan, and now that you're, several years into this, what is the biggest obstacle? What do you think is kind of going to make or break it? Is it a marketing component, like an education component of letting people know why they should be interested in where their food comes from and why they should, prefer or understand the pros and cons of grass finished beef versus feedlot finished beef, so they can make a decision one way or the other? Because I feel like, obviously your family knows what the hell they're doing when it comes to beef production. But what is kind of the I don't know the exact term, but like the kind of the most important factor of the success of this business? Is it the marketing side of things?
Yeah, I really think it is. But that's nuanced. For a long time, I've been part of conversations in Montana, and it feels to me like it's across the system of meat production in the country, of how processing is such a bottleneck. And during COVID, there was a whole bunch of processing dollars that came out and are a part of grant programs to build new plants. But at the end of the day, the more core problem is access to customers, because the world of distribution and retail is every bit as consolidated, controlled by a very few at a huge scale as the processing side is. And so at the end of the day, if you can sell good products to people at a fair price, you can build the processing plant. So Marketing really is the core challenge. And yet I think a lot of people, we think of marketing as telling a certain story and using a whole bunch of channels to get that story out, from the website to podcast to social media. But I think it is just somehow more than that. It's about engaging people and somehow participating with them in something. Mm-hmm. And that's the back to the brewery experience. People show up at a brewery for all different reasons, but at the end of the day, it's an enjoyable place in your community to hang out and spend time and engage with other people. And one of, I think, the biggest changes in the meat industry is when we went to boxed beef. And so if you would imagine back in the 1980s, take this little grocery store chain in Montana called Thriftway. They've got, let's say, 7 stores. Those used to basically receive meat on the bone, hanging carcasses, and they would come into the grocery store meat department and they would be cut on site. And those butchers, it required more labor. And so those butchers would have a tremendous amount of interaction and visiting with the customer, from how you prepare meats to what cut they wanted that day to where these carcasses coming from. When boxed beef happened, all of that cutting meat off of the bone and boxing up primals, that was moved to these central processing facilities. And now the grocery stores become just a vehicle to receive meat and put it out in the case. Mm-hmm. And that really doesn't have anything in the world to do with certifications, grass-fed, hormones. It doesn't have to do with that. It's about touch points with people. And so I have many questions about what does a more regional food system, as particularly with meat, where it's not all just farmers markets, look like, because scale is important to a degree. But at the end of the day, it feels to me like many medium-sized meat companies that have more touch points with the customer, between butchers and chefs, families that are finding ways to participate in the private open spaces in their neck of the world, bringing their kids out to see the ranch, coming to a music festival, food festival, coming to a restaurant where that restaurant knows where many of the things that it serves come from. It's not one thing. It's just about a more distributed set of interactions. And I'm not quite sure how to say it better than that. I think something having integrity. At the end of the day, your people are making decisions on whether to trust something with all kinds of various data points. And it's not a perfect calculus. It's not something they plug into a formula. And many people are not going to follow the whole blockchain down to like, okay, what's the exact weight of this particular animal and what day was it born on? And it's just too much. Most of us are just going to have to make those decisions much more quickly. But a set of interactions that you have with the company leads you to either basically trust them and want to know more and continue to learn more, or it leads you to kind of feel like this is just one other thing out there in the world. It's a commodity without enough context, and I can't connect with it.
Have you ever read any books by Seth Godin? He's like a marketing guru kind of guy.
I have read one by him.
Which one did you read?
I don't even remember. This was 10 years ago or so.
Well, he's got one. I'll send it to you. Actually, you'll like it. It's called "This Is Marketing," and it's about marketing. But in my old days of MBA grad school, I always interpreted the word marketing as kind of slimy or aggressive or pushing stuff down people's throats, kind of tricking people. But Seth Godin's approach to marketing is exactly what you were talking about, like building trust with your potential customer, with the people that are interested in what you're doing. And you can't really separate the product or the process of making the product from the marketing of the product. And I feel like it's a really productive and good way to think about getting the word out. And he's always talking about permission marketing. Like you want your customer or your reader or your listener or whatever to be excited to hear from you. You don't want to be like shoving it down their throat, like here, this is what I have. And so anyway, I think you'll get a lot out of that book. I'm obsessed with Seth Godin. I think he's a genius.
I'd love that.
Yeah. I think you'd get some value out of it. And if you don't, you can yell at me and tell me I don't know what I'm doing. What's been the biggest surprise? I mean, you said you sat down, wrote a business plan, and now you're well into this thing. What has been either the most positive or the most negative, or maybe there's no value associated with it, just the biggest surprise that you've had running this business and getting this thing up and going?
The first biggest surprise was, when we started, there's so many different dimensions from the restaurant side to the processing side to the e-commerce. You can't know who all those people on your team are going to be. It just requires so many different skill sets and so many different types of people. But it's been amazing to me as we just sort of started putting steady pressure on this big mountain to climb, how people with just tremendous skill sets have come out of the woodwork, really talented people that believe in what we're doing. We've just gradually found the people that we need in our existing network. And some of these folks have the head of our meat program came from south of Austin, by way of before that being a butcher in California. Our culinary director, marketing director, Andrew Mace, grew up in Montana, but had spent the last 15 years in Portland restaurants. We had a woman come from Pennsylvania who was a butcher. And so some people have come from kind of far and wide, but there's also just people all over Montana, a guy who had grown up on a ranch with a small meat processing plant in northern Montana, and a fellow who had moved here from California with his family, kind of starting over, who had worked for a company called Build.com, sort of an online competitor to Home Depot that really understood e-commerce. And it's been a pleasant surprise once we stepped out and took a risk to discover these people who are all they're all making less money than they otherwise would have been making, but they want to live in Montana. They want to find a meaningful way to spend their time. And it's one of the most rewarding things. The other thing, when we launched this small restaurant, we found a way to launch it for very little money. We approached a bar in downtown Helena that had a kitchen, but it was the person who ran the kitchen had been there for a long time and was thinking about retiring. And I just approached them and said, hey, could we lease this and do a very minor renovation? Andrew came up with a menu and a concept. We worked together to kind of freshen it up and launched back in October of 21. And the community just showed up in force from day one. Even though it's this little tiny enterprise in the midst of everything that we're doing, it was right away something that was concrete and tangible, and we could manage something at a small scale and tweak its profitability. And it's just not slowed down from the beginning. And so it was this way for us to sort of test the appetite in the Helena market for, are people in the community into this kind of thing? And so
That's really
it was
cool.
huge. It was hugely surprising. And it's not something a study or, some feasibility report could have told us. We just had to step out and do something and put it out there.
Yeah, I think that's a good lesson for people to hear. That you can write the business plan all day long, but until you're out there in the middle of it, you don't know.
Oh yeah.
There's no way to know.
Yeah, it's about adapting. Once you turn the thing loose, then it's all, it's observing what is happening, adapting it and tweaking it constantly. So it still is the core business that we set out to do, but lots has morphed and changed and that will no doubt will continue.
Another question about the business side of things, because I'm fascinated with just how much you have going on and then how many different sides of this business there are. So you've got, in a given day, things that could need to be done. I mean, that you could be worried about are there enough napkins at the restaurant, all the way up to how much carbon is the ranch sequestering from the atmosphere in this global warming environment we're in. So you could go across from the most micro to the most wide open, big question there is. So how do you, what do you focus on a daily basis? How do you measure your progress or measure your success or stay focused in what could be a very fragmented, your attention could get very fragmented with all the different things you could be thinking about on a daily basis with this business, not to mention your family and your hobbies and everything else.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a constant struggle to keep from fragmenting too much. But I think the main things are, there's clearly the North Star of, we got to get profitable. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get the entire set of businesses in the black. And we know, how far we have to go in order to get there. We know the infrastructure we need to be able to operate, to be able to have enough revenue in each one of those enterprises. And then the other thing is investing in really good people up front has allowed me, to really trust that certain things are getting taken care of, from the management of that restaurant on a day-to-day basis to, we have a small processing facility across town, also in Helena, where we, just to begin doing something, we started processing 4-H animals and wild game. And now we also process our own meat there. And we have a tremendous team that is managing that operation. And I think it's a combination of really knowing where the North Star is in terms of the economics. And then it's really investing on the front end in good people. And the hard part of that is that all of a sudden you've got a big payroll, but I think, the opposite approach does not give us enough bandwidth to execute in this particular business. I think there are other types of business where you may be able to go incredibly lean for a long time. This isn't one of them. When you're processing meat and when you work with a lot of ranchers, when you're running a restaurant, there's just a lot of just daily work, cutting the potatoes.
Sure. So whether you're interested in the business aspect or not, June 23rd to 25th is going to be a really, really, really fun event. And I may have just said this on here, but I said it before we started recording that I wish I had thought of this idea, because I wouldn't have been able to I'm not organized enough to put it on. But the Old Salt Festival is going to be really, really exciting. And I would just like to attend, but it's extra cool that I get to be involved. Can you talk about some of the different musicians, artists, craftsmen, writers that are going to be in attendance?
Yeah, I can't wait for this event. It's been kind of brewing for the last couple of years in my mind. And Andrew Mace, our marketing director, he's a magician with wood-fired cooking. And so it's been something he's thought about for a while. So it's a coming together of a lot of different people and their ideas. But essentially, this is a festival that includes our favorite and most essential things. It's like incredible food. We're going to have a 40-foot cinder block fire where the first night it's hogs being roasted, all coming from these Montana ranches. The second night, it's going to be beef and lamb. And the third day, it's going to be barbacoa prepared by Eduardo Garcia and his Montana Mex team. The person doing the hog roast, Elias Cairo, has really built the name for himself with Olympia Provisions, a wonderful chef, Jeremy Charles. And so this kind of food production in itself is something that I'm not aware of happening in Montana. And it's going to be in a beautiful setting at the base of Hoodoo Mountain in Helmville, where I grew up, where you really can't see the highway, but you're not too far from, Missoula, you're not too far from Helena. So some people will be coming and spending 2 nights with us and camping, and other people will be able to pop in and participate just on a daily basis. I'm really excited to have Riddy Arman at the festival. I discovered her through, a lot of people may follow the Western as fuck.
Yeah. I think it's got like 1 million views or something.
Oh man. And she's just, she's an example of one of these regional artists who's, the absolutely top tier quality and really kind of embodies the West. And I think the mystique of the West and like the best parts of the mystique of the West.
Yes. Yes.
And, folks that, that many people know that have been around a long time, like Jalon Crosland, Wyoming artist who I'm really excited to have there. And some of these folks are from, they're from Missoula and Helena, and they're much smaller acts that don't have a big name out there, but there's just high quality music. And so, 13 or 14 bands, that list will continue to develop as we approach, as we move towards the festival in June. And then, folks that I've admired for a long time, like David James Duncan, people may know him from the River Wye, or his book, The Brothers K. And he has a new book coming out that I'm very excited about, and that he will sort of talk about at the festival. But he's imagining, like, what does this future community of people who are more connected to each other, more connected to their place, who have learned to have a better respect for the land and wildlife in the community they're part of, what does that look like? A woman named Deborah Magpie Erling, who's going to be telling ghost stories, around the campfire at 10 p.m. It's really, if you imagine the festival grounds, there's sort of 3 main venues. There's a main stage where the main 40-foot cooking fire is. There's a second venue, which we call the general store, which is makers, people who are just making beautiful things out of wool, out of leather, hats, clothing, jewelry. I'm thinking of Jillian Kuski from Noisy Plume. I think you might have had her on the podcast.
Yeah, both she and Kate Havstad they were 2 of the 4 women in my live podcast in Bozeman. And so kind of getting that group back together, that'll be awesome. They're both powerhouses. And
it's just going to be an incredible, just to have them present, let alone having their products, but to have them present for the conversations. Most music festivals that you go to they're just going to be a blast. You're going to have a drink and you're going to listen to some amazing music, and you're maybe going to have 2, 3, 4 drinks. And this will be festive, but it's going to be contemplative in a way as well, that I think it may be a hard balance to strike, but we have all the right people to strike it. The fact to have the idea that we could have mountain and prairie there, having thoughtful conversations with some of the participants, is just a dream. So I'm really delighted to have you there. There's a third stage we call Eagles Point, which is about a half mile away, and it sits up on this formation on Hoodoo Mountain. And it's just basically a circle of old rocks up at the top, and, a pocket of where about 200 to 300 people can sit there and enjoy music on a small stage, some little bites to eat, and overlook the entire Blackfoot Valley, there's going to be one morning conversation up there on Eagles Point that talks about the first conservation easement in Montana was in the Blackfoot Valley. And that particular tool has been impactful for what that valley looks like today. And it's a perfect spot to sit there and look at the valley and have that conversation. So the festival is many things, but it really is, if people are looking for a unique way to engage in the Montana landscape that intrigues them, I can't think of something better.
Oh man, it's going to be so awesome. I can't wait. Well, and I think the thing that, I'm looking forward to every bit of the things that you just listed off and all those people. But I think one thing that is hard to know, hard to kind of measure right now, but I can guarantee it's going to be there, is just everybody that shows up is going to be the kind of people you want to hang around with, and interesting and fun. And I think it's just going to be this gathering of like-minded people, the vast majority of whom I don't know at this point, but I would guess that pretty much anybody at the thing, if you strike up a conversation with them, you're going to have a lot of fun stuff in common and a lot of interesting things to talk about. It's like I did some event this summer at a ranch for mountain and prairie stuff, and we had all these great activities. We hiked up to big alpine lakes and rode horses. And, if you look at the list of events, it was going to be cool. But what made it was the people that came, the people that were attracted to doing those kind of activities. Yeah. And I didn't even really consider that. I was like, oh, this would just be fun. We get to go climb some mountains and do all this stuff. But well, the best part were the people. Super excited. So how to direct people to where to go to learn more about that?
So if folks go to our website, which is oldsaltcoop.com, there's a page there for the festival where you can learn more about who's all going to be there, and we're selling tickets. And we will be up until June 23rd to the 25th is the weekend when this all happens. That's how you can find us.
I appreciate you inviting me. I can't wait. It's going to be really cool. I want to, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more about your personal story and how you ended up doing all this cool stuff. Because I think I was telling you before we started recording that the more I researched your background, the more, like, the deeper I got and the more kind of winding paths it took me down. And you've got so much going on. One of the things I thought was super interesting was you majored in philosophy and biology in college. Is that right?
That's right.
That's kind of, it seems like that's two opposite ends of the spectrum. The only thing I could think would be more is philosophy and math or something. So what, tell me about your interest in philosophy. How'd that come to be?
I think that's more about, just an interest in value systems. And, I'm just curious about the world. I'm interested in none of us can digest even a small amount of what there is to know. We're just more and more, I think it's a lot of us are overwhelmed by the complexity of the world and find ourselves unable to digest everything. And there's a lot of pressure to come up with an intelligent take on any given issue. Then there's this pursuit of wisdom, of acknowledging our limited ability to just wrap our heads around the universe. How do you still live in a way that creates health and provides meaning? So I think that is a perennial question. So I was interested, I guess, in the perennial questions. I grew up Catholic, so I was interested in exploring the faith background that I had come from, and once you're come from such a small town as I did, and then I ended up going to graduate school in Boston for theology. You just come into contact with so many other fascinating people who have a different take on the world. But I still believe, I think it's one of the foundational things about democracy to me, to believe that we have more in common than we have peculiar.
Yes, I agree with that. That's one of the reasons I started this podcast, actually, because you talk to some, I remember when I lived in Boulder, my next door neighbor was like what could be considered a militant environmentalist. Mm-hmm. And then I'd be out talking, in South Park with a far right wing politically rancher who on paper, and that was 2016. So on paper, they were enemies, but they shared about 85% of the common beliefs. Mm-hmm. They cared about 85% of the same things. I think that's pretty good. I don't agree about 85%, probably even with my wife. So, I mean, I think I agree with all that. How is that philosophy training and just that ability to think in that mode of thinking, has that helped you in business?
I think so. A lot of it is basically challenging yourself to engage with really obscure texts and ways of talking and ways of trying to break down a problem, and, really trying to become a better writer, challenging the way you write because it's such a reflection of the way you think, becoming a really good editor and redactor and, using the process of writing to clarify your thought process. All those things, I think, anytime you go to college or you go to graduate school, you're challenged in any field to clarify your thinking. And I think that's the same in philosophy. It certainly was the case also in my theology work, is basically just people smearing things with red pen and me having a chance to learn from that. And so I think that helps you as you begin to write a business plan. You challenge your presuppositions. You ask yourself, for the different elements that you think are core, how well-founded are they? And you also, at the same time, you have to go in with the knowledge that it will need to change. And so how do you build it to be flexible? And I think, a big part of the business is not just, can we sell products and that people like and be profitable doing it, but it's, did we structure the business in a way that ultimately is going to be governed by the right people? And is it going to return value to the ranches so that it really fulfills our first purpose, which is to return more value to the stewardship of land? And is there a way that workers in this business will be able to be part of the governance ultimately and be something more than just a cog in the machine, but will be able to add their own creativity into the business and grow as we grow. And so it mattered a lot, I think, to how we set up the structure of the business.
I read when I was stalking you online, I read there was a quote. It said, you either wrote it or said it. In a world swimming in data, philosophy is all about distilling, prioritizing, and coming up with the most life-giving interpretations to program our hearts, minds, habits, and communities. You're a poet too.
Yeah, I don't know how the heck that came out of my mouth.
No, but I mean, I think that's just what you're saying, distilling all this. You got so much stuff coming at you all day long. How do you distill it down to what's important and then prioritizing, which, I mean, those are super important for any business, but especially the business you're in. So you get out of grad school, theology, then you teach for a few years, then you leave teaching to go into entrepreneurship. How did that happen? Because that, again, seems like kind of different ends of the spectrum. I would think that kind of like a cushy, tenured professor job seems to me to be the exact opposite of running a startup.
Yeah, it's definitely not a path I could have predicted. I mean, while I was in Boston for a couple of years, we spent some time in El Salvador and Honduras.
Oh, what were you doing there?
We were just doing, it was just learning. We spent some time just getting to know people in the campesinos and understanding a little bit about how the government works. And I have not traveled a lot, but I was very interested in social justice, and I started to, even just in these tiny little experiences, I realized how much U.S. agricultural policy was affecting their lives. Dumping grain on their markets doesn't help a farmer there sell their own products for a fair price. Mm-hmm. And I think, I was learning about U.S. engagement, especially in the 1980s in that part of the world, and how much it affected their lives. One of the families I stayed with, they had raised 2 kids in a lot of poverty, and both kids became doctors, but there were no jobs for doctors in their community. They had gone to the University of Central America, and so they were living in the U.S. and sending their money back home. And so I was just realizing that so many of folks' problems elsewhere come from a lack of us cleaning up our own act at home. And I think a lot of that going out made me just want to figure out how to integrate back where, all of my family and all of my context was back in Montana. And so I after school, I came back. I was not sure what to do. I took an adjunct philosophy teaching job at Carroll College, and I was managing the freshman dorms, 300 freshmen. And so that was it.
Wow.
It's just,
I bet you got some stories from that.
It was cheap housing. I do. Yeah. Some of them probably can't be spoken in a public setting. Yeah. But, I was basically, it was cheap housing. It was a way to continue, doing something I knew how to do and just sort of reflect. And I don't know that there's such a thing as a cushy tenured philosophy professorship in Montana or theology. And
if there was, you could get it. You would be the man. You would be the one to get it.
But I mean, I was just realizing that all these questions that I had been asking and my interest really had a real home in the food system, and these questions about how does this family ranch that I grew up in, wanted to be like Dad, wanting to be a rancher, and now the question is, how do we survive? How do we become better stewards of the land? How do we reconnect in a society that feels pretty fragmented? There's a network in the West called Ranching for Profit, and you probably know those guys pretty well. Uh-huh. But my family had participated for a long time, and once you kind of go to the school, there's a thing called Executive Link, where they basically match a given business up with 4 or 5 other businesses that come from a different part of the country, and they critique each other's businesses and they help each other grow. And some of those colleagues through Executive Link decided to form a beef business together. It was originally called Salt of the Earth, and then later called Ranchers Original. They were looking for a young person to, help do the legwork, learn how to price cattle, do all the communication between the co-op members, figure out how to aggregate cattle, figure out where to process them. What does our marketing look like? And so I jumped in and I just started doing that. That was 2012 full time. And we developed a brand. It was based on utilizing cull cows and bulls, which pretty much any ranch in the West, 15 to 20% of their herd ends up being a cull breeding animal. And, 20% of the U.S. beef supply ends up being those culled animals. But by default, they're sort of a pasture animal. and they don't have growth hormones as just part of this standard operating practices. And so we thought, well, we could aggregate a domestic grass-fed supply of U.S. beef, and if we can figure out the marketing of grind, trim, and the lean meats, then we can work ourselves into the middle meats and the finished cattle and the more complex production system. And so we found a buyer who would buy semi-loads of trim for us at a good price in Kansas. We found kind of a unicorn processor in Greeley, Colorado, where they did 100 head a day, which was huge compared to any Montana processor, but tiny compared to the big guys. So it was kind of a sweet spot. We could get a decent price. And it took a lot to get things started up, but we finally had a little bit of traction. And then in a matter of really a couple months, our packer had a heart attack, died, and his wife needed to sell the grinding plant that they had in Fort Morgan. And almost at the same time, this company in Kansas that had been buying semi-loads of trim, the founder, who was our relationship, she lost the majority control of her company, and the board kind of took a different direction with their set of products. And really fast, we found ourselves with a whole bunch of meat in the freezer outside of Denver, and the need to find buyers for that meat. And the whole time we were aware that anything that only has one buyer or one processing option is not a very resilient system. But still, you got to start somewhere. And before you can really go out there into the world to market your products, you kind of got to have products to sample. And so you've got to start, slaughtering animals, and you've got to start getting cut sheets and figure out what your yields are and figure out what your pricing is going to be. And so you kind of have to take a risk and step out there. And we were not able to find enough buyers at the right price. Kind of almost at the same time, country of origin labeling was repealed in Congress. And what that meant is our value proposition for, a good valued domestic grass-fed beef product sort of went away, because, imported grass-fed beef was going to be much cheaper than domestic. And if you don't even distinguish between those two things, you're in a pretty tough position. So it was sort of a perfect storm. At the end of the day, that whole business, it had all the right values, some really tremendous producers who really care about land behind it. But at the end of the day, it didn't feel like local food to me. I mean, we were still going to Greeley to process. We were, I would only see that meat occasionally when I would visit the plant. The rest of the time it would go across the cutting floor, and it would be, stored in a warehouse outside Denver. And I would be trying to represent that product to somebody I had never met, from a company out of Boise that was just trying to find low-cost grass-fed beef, and ultimately found that more cheaply outside of the country. And so I think it was a real, sort of a mini MBA for me, an expensive one.
Much more valuable than an MBA.
But
because you were doing it, you weren't sitting there reading about it, and your ass was on the line, and you were in the middle of it. I used to read all these and listen to all these interviews with like angel investors and private equity investors. And I remember there were several unrelated ones, but these investors were saying that they would not invest into a business or into co-founders or founders of a business unless those co-founders had gotten their ass kicked pretty hard at some point previously, because you learn lessons that you can't learn any other way. It's like we were joking around before I started this, and I said one time I forgot to hit record on the podcast. I'm like, well, I'll never make that mistake again. And so like through screwing up or market, the whims of the market that you may not have even known existed, and just you learn these lessons and you come out so much wiser. So as you're starting Old Salt, or well into starting Old Salt, what lessons have you applied from that experience with Rancher's Original?
I think the lessons are a little bit back to what I said earlier that I was sort of pleasantly surprised about, which is that it was two of us in Rancher's Original basically doing the work and reporting back to the board of ranches that controlled it. And I just felt like we needed a whole bunch more human capacity. We invested in that with Old Salt on the front end. And that meant we had to have enterprises that had a little bit of revenue to cover that payroll. And so we, instead of taking a long time to build a brand and build up all the marketing language around the brand, we just launched a restaurant. I could be, I was there in the restaurant I'm not much of a chef, but thankfully Andrew is, so I could just be the guy that takes out the cardboard and figures out composting and cleans the grease trap. And I mean, so the first 3 months, I mean, we were all just in there every night, and it's a lot of work to do that and all the other things we needed to do at the same time. But at the same time, it gave us a front row seat to what we needed to improve. And, it also just felt meaningful. Like customers were there, we were interacting with them. It was something real and tangible and concrete that we could sink our teeth into, rather than just lots of graphic design and social media and talking about something. And I also, at the end of the day, we just decided that we need to step out and buy a little processing plant and learn to cut meat before we actually invest in a bigger USDA plant. And so that's kind of where we're at right at this moment, is we're sitting there working to really understand our costs and where we can get more efficient in this tiny little plant, 2 little 1,000-square-foot buildings that aren't even connected. But at the same time, though, we can implement a traceability system on that tiny scale. We can learn how to use Shopify. We can figure out whether it's the deboning and cutting, or the work on the table, or the packaging, or the value-added production. That's our production bottleneck, and we can refine that process, that profitability at a small scale. And I think we're learning a lot about what is the real. If we build a big facility that's many millions of dollars, what's the real demand to move livestock through that plant? And if we can't do it on a small scale, we're not going to be able to do it on a big scale. And so just jumping in and taking some risks that actually involved investment in steel was important, I think. I think there's a lot of just food companies out there that the concept is develop a really good brand and then go find a co-packer who can do it for you. And when it comes to meat, at least for us, I think we just felt like we needed to dive in at a small scale.
Yeah, and controlling some of the variables that were out of your control the last time. I mean, that seems, I can't imagine the amount of work. What time do you wake up?
I usually wake up between 4:30 and 5:30, depending on the day.
I knew it. You seem like a 4:30 type. What time do you go to bed?
Oh, it's all over the board, but I sleep all right. Like I'm usually in bed by 10, I would say.
What do you do for fun? What do you do when you're not working?
Once a month, I have a band, a country kind of blues.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Band. I have it in my notes.
Yeah, so it's called Copper Queen, and we play usually once a month here in Helena, and that definitely keeps me sane. I'm no great musician, but I play banjo and guitar, and I love music. Yeah,
you're a Renaissance man.
There's a couple out there. They're in Horsefly, British Columbia, and they're called Jason and Ferris Romero. They build banjos and they write and play music. And like, if I could just point towards one, I know you kind of always ask people about the books that they like. Well, here's a hot tip on like an artist that you just have to check out. Jason and Ferris Romero. Like that's living, to just listen to them.
Right. Well, that's people tell me I need to ask more about music and I always forget. I guess I'm just like stuck in my ways now, but that's awesome. I will have links to them in the notes and I'll check them out myself. As far as books, I can't let you go without asking about books. It's because you got such a wide, you could be doing On the Origin of Species by Darwin, and then something from Plato, and then something from Alan Savory. Give me some book recommendations.
Small is Beautiful was probably the most influential book for me. E.F. Schumacher. It's all about the question of scale and appropriate technology. To me, it's one of the most human books I've ever read. And when it comes to really focusing in on what the goal is and what is important about scale and technology in its proper place, that book was just huge for me. There's a conversation. I think I first heard about him through Wes Jackson at the Land Institute. He was talking about Schumacher making a visit to Kansas. And I think that's where I first encountered him. And then I loved Boston was my first experience where people were saying, hey, didn't you know ranching and meat are bad for the planet? And I was starting to just engage more in these questions that I hadn't encountered when I was young. And I read Wendell Berry's Unsettling of the American West, or The Unsettling of America, I think is what it's called. And then one of his fiction books, Jayber Crow. And I thought that he was talking about, what makes human beings happy and how important it is for us to be humble and how important a community and culture is that was powerful for me. I think there's a guy named Nathan Sayer that you probably are aware of, who writes a lot about the West, and he has a book called Working Wilderness that kind of talks about the Malpai Borderlands group down in Arizona or New Mexico. That's really similar to a watershed group that I grew up, the Blackfoot Challenge, right in my backyard.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea of how very critical these working lands are to wild places, that was a formative book for me. He quotes a guy in there, he's now deceased, named Jim Corbett, who talked about, originally he was a real ranching sort of skeptic back in the range wars days of the early 90s. But he is, I think the quote is, ranching is now the only livelihood based on adaptation to wild biotic communities. He ultimately came to see ranching as this place where, if it's done well and done thoughtfully, it can be economically productive, but it really leaves space for the native, plants and wildlife, and for the wide open spaces that so many people value. And so that really just grabbed me. And it was a big reason why I came to Western Landowners Alliance.
Those are great. And I haven't read, I've got The Unsettling of America, but I've flipped through it, but I've not read it all the way through. I haven't read any of those. That's exactly the kind of recommendations I want. Those are great. So, knowing everything, living in this just beautiful landscape in Montana, having this 5 generations of connection to the land in your family, degree in philosophy, biology, theology, entrepreneur, do you have any kind of wise parting words? And you can just, you don't have to think about all the people listening. You can think about, direct them at me, because I need some wisdom from you. Like, this dumbass I'm talking to needs to understand this. Give me some wise words.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be a fool to try to impart wisdom, but
you've been doing it for the last hour.
The things I still remember the most are, my dad and my, uncles talked about being short timers in the Blackfoot Valley. Basically, this world, this place is so much older than us. We're here for such a short time. It's private property, but it's sort of very little p private property. It's, we're here for a short time, and it's our obligation to leave it better than we found it. And so they always felt a higher purpose, and they had a respect and a reverence for the beauty and the complexity of the natural world. They really prioritized their own people. They worked a lot on family communication, and they cared a lot about the Helmville and the larger Blackfoot community. They really prioritized partnerships. They felt like we were stronger together than alone. I think when you acknowledge how interdependent you are on everybody else, and how sort of small you are, there's just a sense of gratitude that is always important to maintain. And it makes you feel like, gosh, so much has gone in, so much goes into the raising of a human being. And if you've received love in your life, and if you've had a meal on the table, and you've been relatively secure, you've just received so much. And so you need to try to give a little bit more than you take. And that, if any of us could ever do that, that would be an amazing accomplishment, because this is a Wendell Berry thing. We are all takers. We depend on resources. We depend so much on other people. And so finding a sense of gratitude for that, and then working to try to give as much as you can, is important to me. At the end of the day, Old Salt, I'm really grateful to get to talk about it with you, and it could end up in a big mess, but I think it's just some things are worth doing, regardless of, you cannot control the outcome, but it's just like, hey, you only live once, and you have to find a way to do something meaningful, with your time. And that usually involves, at least I think it often involves, taking on a big challenge.
I agree, man. This is super inspiring. I love this conversation. I can't wait to hang out in person with you and your whole family in June. But thanks for taking the time. And I'm excited to continue to watch and spread the word about everything you're doing. But thanks so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time to visit with you and to share what we're up to. And I also love hearing the conversations that you curate. It's just you've got to always constantly search for inspiration and new ideas out there. And Mountain Prairie is a fertile place to find interesting people and really cool projects.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable. so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.